to join us this morning on our support series. Just, the usual housekeeping, microphone on mute, and don't worry, the webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available, and the slides will also be made available. So in these installments of the support series, I'm delighted to be joined by Petya Toncheva, who's a senior consultant at Mabbett Associates. And Mabbett Associates, the climate and carbon team, can help any organizations on their journey to net zero at any point of that journey. So being, setting up the baseline, or, going through targets, or building up a strategy, that sort of things. So I'm pleased in that support series to be joined again by Petya. And I'm going to hand over my screen to Petya and to explain how Mabbett Associates can help. So Petya, if you want to take over.
Okay. Just a second. Eric, will you be sharing on your side, or it will be me here on this side? Because I think it's no longer on the screen. But I can share on this side, that's fine. Hey, good morning, everyone. So as Eric already mentioned, my name is Petya Toncheva, and I work as part of the climate and carbon team at Mabbett Associates. Mabbett Associates is engineering, process safety, and environment consultancy. So we help businesses within the environment group and the climate and carbon team. We help businesses of different size, small and medium-sized enterprises or larger companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, to build a net zero strategy. So pretty much we can support from setting the baseline of the carbon emissions. So the company has a clear idea of what emissions are generated from the activities they undertake. We then look at different opportunities for reducing those emissions, concentrating on the areas of most significance to the business within their direct operations and within their supply chain. And we are also we can also help with the carbon offset strategy as well. So pretty much every step in a net zero journey is something we can support the business with. So today, the presentation I will show will provide you a basic idea of what steps to take to start to start on your net zero journey, and this will cover these few topics. So what do we mean by net zero? First of all, it's important to understand what this term means, as it is quite often used interchangeably with other terms, like, for example, carbon neutral. We will look briefly through the net zero drivers. So what drives net zero globally and in the UK? How to achieve net zero, which are the main steps to take. And from there, we will just look at the different steps within a net zero approach. So a carbon footprint, an emission reduction pathway, and an emission removal pathway. And I will soon explain what this means. And then what a decarbonization or a net zero plan includes, what it should include. So I will go through the presentation, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them after I have completed the presentation. Starting with the term net zero. So net zero, what you see here on the screen is the term explained by the Science Based Target Initiative, which is the initiative helping businesses to set science-based targets. So these are targets which are in line with the Paris Agreement's commitment to reduce global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it is 1.5 degrees Celsius to ensure that any reversible changes to the climate will be prevented. So any target set in line with this commitment, global commitment, is considered a science-based target. And this initiative provides all the tools, provides all the tools and guidance for different types of businesses and industries of how these targets can be set. So how they determine net zero? How they determine net zero is achieving a state in which the activities within the value chain of a company result in no net impact on the climate from greenhouse gas emissions. So in simple terms, that means that whatever is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions generated by a company, an equivalent amount of emissions should be removed from the atmosphere, so that a net zero balance is achieved. So that's what net zero means. Very often, net zero is used instead of carbon neutral, or carbon neutral as a term is used instead of net zero. But just for clarity for everyone, there is a difference between these two terms. So, and that's the difference lies between the type of emission sources the boundary of these two terms covers. So, for example, carbon neutral can be achieved following the requirements of a standard called PAS 2060. So this standard will soon be replaced by a new standard. It will still follow the same requirements, but it will be replaced by ISO 14068-1, and this will happen in 2025. So there is still time until the new standard comes into force. Before that, PAS 2060 can still be used, but that's the standard to follow if you're to achieve a carbon neutral status. So carbon neutral status, if you would like to be carbon neutral, you can become carbon neutral only for your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So that means you can achieve carbon neutrality just for the areas which are directly controlled by the company. You don't need to include your supply chain emissions in this. So it's not mandatory. If you are though on the route to achieving net zero, you will have to consider all the areas within your supply chain and the emissions generated there. So not only your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and I will mention what this covers, but also your supply chain or scope 3 emissions. Another difference between the carbon neutral and net zero term is that for a carbon neutral could be just a product, a service from the organization, while when we talk about net zero, the boundary refers to the whole organization. So if you're a manufacturer, you manufacture a product and you want this product to be carbon neutral, you can do that. Or it could be a service or just a part of the organization, just a business part of the organization. But when we talk about net zero, that would cover the whole organization. And the most important part between the two is the target level. So a net zero target is a science-based target. So it is aligned to the 1.5 degree commitment that I mentioned earlier, while the carbon neutral target level is not specified. So it could be adjusted based on what the company wants. So it could be, it doesn't have to align with a specific commitment or a goal, just like with the net zero. And then finally, the main difference, another difference, not the main, but another difference is what happens with the emissions that remain unabated at the end after you've exhausted all other options of reduction of emissions, so the residual emissions. So if you are to achieve carbon neutrality, you can simply offset all the emissions you generate. That's for the first year, because carbon neutrality is an annual commitment, an annual recertification process. For the first year, you're allowed to purchase carbon offsets equivalent to the total emissions generated by the company. While with net zero, the main goal is to remove emissions from the atmosphere. So whatever is generated has to be removed, not simply offset. And again, the main goal will be identifying opportunities within the company to reduce the emissions. And when there is no other opportunity left and you've explored all options, then there will be some residual emissions and you will have to think about investing in carbon removal projects. And I will mention about this as well. But I just wanted to clarify what the difference between the two terms is, so there is no confusion. So today I'm talking about net zero, not carbon neutrality. So carbon neutrality is not a bad thing in any way at all. It is something that could be achieved on the route during the journey to net zero. So it could be a goal or a midterm or a short-term goal you want to achieve, but the main goal overall should be to become net zero in the end. So what are the net zero drivers? Why net zero is so important? So the main drivers globally is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Probably some of you are aware of it. It's an international treaty which was signed in 1994, so a long time ago, and over 197 countries. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has the objective to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level which would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So it will prevent human damage and any damage to the climate system. So that's the main goal. And as part of this framework convention on climate change, there are conferences which are conducted every year. So the first one that was done was the COP21, or the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015 on one of those conferences organized by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it is a very important agreement in terms of preventing damage on the climate, because its main goal is to limit the warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial levels, which will be 1990. So it is important. It's the first legally binding international treaty, so it's a very important one, and this is what really sets the scene for all the national governments who have actually committed to this goal. And the UK is one of those countries who has signed the agreement, and as a result of this, the UK has obviously put in place the necessary regulations and legislation to ensure that this commitment is achieved, and they adhere, and the country adheres to the commitment made. So the most important the most important document, or a legal document in the UK related to climate change and to preventing damage to the climate, is the Climate Change Act 2008. So that's the first. This act actually commits the country, the UK, to net zero emissions by 2050, with an interim target of 78% reduction by 2035. So this is what sets, the main commitment that the UK sets with the Climate Change Act. And it also sets 5-yearly carbon budgets for each sector of the economy, which is overseen by an independent committee on climate change. So these are the main probably drivers to be aware of. So that would be the COP21 Paris Agreement globally, and for the UK is the Climate Change Act 2008. So in terms of other drivers, for net zero, obviously, that would be any mandatory reporting in the UK for companies. So that will mean where energy and associated emissions must be disclosed as part of the director's report of the companies, for example, which is the result of the streamlined energy and carbon reporting scheme. So this scheme came into place in 2019, in April. And it is applicable to all large companies in the UK with more than £36 million turnover. And as part of the requirements of the scheme, each large company should disclose on an annual basis their energy use in the UK only and the emissions associated with this energy use. And these are limited only to Scope 1, Scope 2, and just a small part of Scope 3. Another scheme which is also relevant when we talk about preventing or reducing emissions is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. This scheme has been available for a long period of time. So again, it covers large companies and requires energy audits to be conducted across buildings, industrial processes, and transport. At the end, the report is required on cutting energy consumption with costed recommendations. So these are the two mandatory reporting schemes at the moment, which require not only disclosing your energy consumption, but also calculating emissions and taking measures as well, identifying measures for carbon reduction, energy and carbon reduction, where the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme comes into place. So these are the main drivers when we talk about net zero. So how then we can achieve net zero? So it is important to follow a recognized methodology. And in this sense, the Science Based Targets Initiative is probably at the moment the most widely used methodology or approach to achieving net zero, as it is aligned with the commitment set by the Paris Agreement. So, and the three steps that need to be taken in line with the Science-Based Target Initiative's requirements is to measure your Scope 1 and 2 emissions and your significant Scope 3 emissions. So what significant means is that if more than 40% of your total emissions are attributable to Scope 3, then the Scope 3 emissions will have to be measured as well. So after you have set the baseline, your carbon baseline, the next step will be to set an ambitious target to reduce your full value chain emissions. So that means it should be a science-based target and it should be in line with limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that means you will be setting a target to achieve net zero by 2050. And obviously, with the overall target, long-term target, there will be short-term, mid-term targets that needs to be set as well, and for different areas and parts of your carbon footprint. And finally, once the carbon footprint baseline is set, targets have been set, then the next step will be to reduce emissions from all scopes. So identifying reduction opportunities internally, that could be through undertaking audits for different parts of the business. It could be through feasibility studies, etc., and actually evaluating these opportunities in terms of savings. So how much the implementation of a project will reduce the emissions, but also how costly it will be. So taking into consideration those things. And in line with the Science-Based Target Initiatives, 90 to 95% of the emissions of an organization should be reduced through actual reduction projects. The remaining 5 to 10% of residual emissions will have to be balanced with an equivalent amount of certified greenhouse gas removals. So these are removal projects which For example, I've given here is afforestation, reforestation projects. It could be wetland restoration projects, which actually capture carbon from the atmosphere and store this carbon for a long period of time. So these are the main steps to achieving net zero. So the first one is the carbon footprint baseline. So important thing about the carbon footprint is following again a standard methodology, which is recognized, internationally recognized, like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard. There are other standards as well, which are specific to the type of assessment you're trying to do. For example, there is the PAS 2050 British standard, which is for calculating the carbon footprint specifically for products and services. So that's different. There are the ISO 14040 and 14044 as well. The environmental product declarations, which are again specific to the carbon footprint of products. But the main thing is that when you're conducting a carbon assessment of an organization, even a project or a product, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol contains all the guidance you need. Typically, in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there are three scopes.
I'm not ignoring you. I'm on that net zero webinar.
So there are three scopes. Scope 1 covers all the assets which are owned and controlled by the company and emissions associated with those assets. So it could be any, for example, owned stationary equipment, whether it's generators, whether it's for example, heaters or any other equipment like this, it will fall within scope 1. Same as with vehicles. Any owned vehicles or vehicles on a long-term leased by the company will fall within scope 1. Scope 2 is very simple in terms it covers purchased electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. So these are the emissions associated with the generation of purchased electricity, for example. And their indirect emissions, as the company as the consumer of this electricity, has an indirect impact on the climate. And then scope 3 is the biggest category of emission sources. It covers all the activities upstream and downstream the supply chain of an organization. And relates to calculating the emissions from purchased goods and services, for example, upstream transportation and distribution, waterways, etc. So in achieving net zero status, all these three scopes and emission sources within these scopes should be taken into consideration and emissions should be calculated. So once the carbon footprint baseline has been established by the company, the next step will be to think about how these emissions will be reduced. What you're seeing here on the screen is an example of an emissions reduction pathway, which is in line with the 1.5 degrees of global average temperature scenario, the commitment set by the Paris Agreement. So what can you see here? What this model defines is net zero as at least 90% reduction versus the baseline year here, 2021. So we have, if we take 2021 in blue, we have scope 1 emissions. In red, we have scope 2 emissions. That's our baseline emissions. And then every year, we have plotted what the emissions reduction effort will have to be so that net zero is achieved in 2040 in this case. The little bar in 2040 in red is the residual emissions. So after internal reductions undertaken for the period between 2021 to 2040, there will still be 5 to 10% emissions remaining. And this will be the residual emissions, which will have to be offset or balanced through investing in carbon removal projects. But when talking about reducing emissions after you have established your carbon footprint, what's important is to select the obviously baseline year. Pick the correct science-based target methodology. So typically with the science-based target initiative requires that you either set your net zero pathway in line with the below 2 degrees temperature scenario or 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is the preferable one just because it is the global average temperature which would avoid any irreversible changes to the climate. So if you model your science-based emissions trajectory for 1.5 degrees scenario, as it is shown in the slide, that then you will have to build a strategy by assessing emission reductions from current and potential projects. So pretty much you need to have your baseline emissions, take these baseline emissions, and taking into account any changes, whether it's a growth changes related to the company, you factor this in and you try to plot the emissions from your baseline to the set target year for achieving net zero, which in this case is 2040. And this way you will be able to see what this emissions pathway will be on your route to achieving net zero. So that's one of the steps that needs to be taken after establishing your carbon footprint baseline. What we saw here on this graph in 2040, I said that there will be some residual emissions left. So these residual emissions, you then need to think how you can balance these residual emissions. So there are two ways, two types of or two approaches, so carbon offsetting and carbon removal. As mentioned earlier, if we talk about carbon neutrality, we will be mainly focusing on investing and purchasing carbon offset credits. If we are talking about net zero, the main goal will be thinking about removing carbon from the atmosphere, which means investing in carbon removal projects. How you actually start on building your carbon removal pathway. So first of all, we need to know the volume of emissions that needs to be balanced to zero. So we saw in the previous graph how much this was. That's just an example. Then we need to agree on the timelines for balancing these emissions. And then we need to identify these potential options for carbon offsetting and carbon removal. So what is carbon offsetting? Just to be clear about the difference between. So when 1 metric ton of carbon is emitted, 1 metric ton of carbon is avoided elsewhere. So this is what happens when we talk about carbon offsetting. And examples of this is, for example, is energy efficiency projects. Or for example, investing on biogas projects. So when you invest in a biogas project, you are avoiding the use of firewood. So this is why we are talking that carbon offsetting is about avoiding carbon emitted somewhere else by investing in a certain project. So it could be clean water treatment projects in the developing world. So this type of carbon offset projects can happen anywhere in the world. And it's about investing, purchasing carbon credits, which are generated through the reductions achieved through the implementation of those projects you're investing in. So that's carbon offsetting. Carbon removal is a different thing. So when 1 metric ton of carbon is emitted, 1 metric ton is removed completely from the atmosphere and stored for a long period of time. So examples is the reforestation or afforestation projects, because we know that the plants capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it. The carbon sequestration in soil, so actually investing in good sustainable agricultural practices will help to increase the quality of the soil, for example, and this soil will be able to retain more carbon for a long period of time. So these are types of, or wetland restoration. These are projects which are carbon removal projects, and these are the projects that need to be considered when it comes to offsetting or balancing your residual emissions. What in the end, just to summarize, what a decarbonization or a net zero plan should look like. So having established the carbon footprint baseline, then having plotted your greenhouse gas emissions over the period of your net zero journey from a baseline to the target year, so you know what you're supposed to reduce on an annual basis, and then identifying projects that needs to be also accounted for within this model, so you know how these projects will impact your journey, net zero journey, and you know what the residual emissions will be. Then you need to have all this formalized, and to do that you will need a net zero plan, so a document which pretty much covers all these areas we have discussed so far. So obviously a net zero strategy will have like just an example content I've given here on the slide. So key terms and definitions, introduction, your successes to date, your emissions baseline results, your targets, then any activity streams. These are the different areas of significance to your business in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Action plan. So this is a plan with identified projects within the company, evaluated projects of how they will reduce emissions, responsibilities and governance section, which will talk about who will be responsible, how this net zero strategy will be governed and implemented, financing, risks and opportunities. So these are like the main areas or the main topics that needs to be included within a net zero plan. And finally, there will be some loopholes, of course, that could make a net zero strategy less credible, and you need to be mindful of those. So you need to ensure that the net zero strategy is in line with the completeness principle of the greenhouse gas protocol, which means that all sources of emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3 should be covered within your net zero target, within the boundary of your net zero target. So there shouldn't be exclusion of certain gases or certain sources of emissions. Relying on removing carbon from the atmosphere to achieve the target rather than reducing emission in absolute terms in line with the science-based target, set science-based trajectories. So it is important that you identify actual reduction projects within the company first. And if that's no longer possible or practically achievable, then whatever is left will have to be removed through investing in carbon removal projects. Delaying action to reduce emissions or enhance carbon sinks, so action should be taken now. And not committing to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So obviously that's the main goal in the end, and that's with everything I've mentioned so far. These are the steps to be taken so that a net zero status is achieved in the end. So it should be in line with the commitment of achieving global average temperature of up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that means following the guidance and recommendations of the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is probably the only one at the moment which follows, is in line with the Paris Agreement. So these are the main things I wanted to cover today in relation to net zero, and I hope this has given you like a basic overview of what steps to take and how to initiate your net zero journey. If I'm happy to answer questions right now, Eric.
Yeah, thanks very much, Petya. Much appreciated. So as Petya said now, the floor is open for question. Either come off mute and ask your question or put your question in the chat. And Mary, who is helping me today, will be happy to read those questions. So please, any questions from the floor? Was an exhaustive presentation from Petya, reviewing what needs to be done if you want to go down that route and what not to be done if you want to go that route. Any question? Anything in the chat? Okay, so if there isn't any questions, then I'm going to go on to the part 2, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen. Yeah. So what we're going to be talking about it. We're still going on our route of the 5W to achieve on net zero. We talked about it. Today we're going to look at the where and how. So the why, the what, and the when has been addressed in previous webinars we had in July and August, and today we're going to look at the where and how. And in terms of the where, the update I'll provide you will be on boundaries, organizational and operational. And a topic that's coming quite often in the one-to-one is materiality, what counts and doesn't count. On how, we look at the standard development, which have been mentioned by Petya. And something else that's coming a lot in the one-to-one lately is CBAM, now carbon border adjustment mechanism, mainly in the EU, which is being implemented, and the impact that's having on the UK, which is at the consultation stage just now. So that's the plan for today. So starting with the step 3, which is aware, which makes it measurable in your smart roadmap, is about defining the boundaries. So when you look at a business, roughly speaking, that's the way it works. You procure material, that material is transported and packaged and transported. Then you transform it, manufacture and package it. To do that, you will need energy and water, and it's likely that effluent in the waste is going to come out. And then that's your gate. Then you've got transport and distribution. So that transportation may or may not be controlled by the supplier, or it may be controlled by the customers. And that could be the customers or retailers, or that could be if you are a B2B business, or that could be the consumer if you are a B2C business. And then the customer, if he is a retailer, may pass that on to the consumer, but ultimately it's going to get disposed and recycled. So these are your direct emissions, roughly speaking. That's what you emit when you transform the product. This is your indirect emission. That's what you need to transform the product. And that's your gate. So when you hear about cradle to gate, that's usually what it means, up to your gate. That's a cradle to gate analysis from the product you purchase to your gate. The supply chain analysis will include transport and distribution. Our recommendation usually include that if you control it, if it's controlled by your customer because your terms and conditions mean that it's their role to come and pick up the goods, then you may want to exclude it. But it is the downstream piece, the supply chain analysis. And then the holistic is life cycle analysis. That's 4940 and 4944 that Petya mentioned. That's where you've got the whole thing from the raw material all the way to its disposal. So those are the way to account for your emissions, the accounting methods. On the operational boundaries, the big one is about materiality. And how do you do materiality assessment? So you would need to consider quantitative factors. So those quantitative factors could be the size of the emissions, so maybe anywhere between 5 and 80%. The influence you have on reducing those emissions, can you do it? Is that doable? And then the variability, are you looking at an ROI of less than a year, which would be great, or are you looking at an ROI of more than 10 years, which is no way to get there, Then you've got your qualitative factors. So those could be, is it applicable or not? What is the quality of the data you've got? So is it tertiary data? Is it primary data? What is the quality you do? And how well is it aligned to your stakeholder needs? That's the main thing, your consumer, your customer, but also your employees, your community, that sort of thing. That's what you need to consider. And then that's where your professional judgment, your expertise, your knowledge kicks in. how big a risk is it? Can you reshore it? So it cannot be done in-house, or did you used to do it and then bring it back? So that's the outsourcing piece of it. And then what is the roadmap, the ambition? So if you think about the steel industry, for example, what is their plan in terms of the industry, and is it global, or is that really local Scotland, or is it actually more than Scotland? The organisation industry itself, the type of industry is rather just an overall manufacturing. So those are your professional judgment. And then you need a sliding scale. And that sliding scale, you can see every one of them's got 1 to 5, that's a sliding scale. And then aggregation impact. And the aggregation or recommendation is use the multiplication, not the addition. And the reason you're using the multiplication is because it gives you a big number. So it's easier to differentiate. And then when does it apply? Then it's going to automatically be 0. So that's our recommendation. So that's the way you can assess materiality. And why do you want to know? Why is it important? Well, if you look at the standards, they've got different views on materiality and threshold. They all agree. We talked about it in the past. All the standards have agreed on the overarching principles, but it's in the detail they diverge. So they all converge. They all agree that it needs to be complete. But then, in terms of thresholds, they start to vary. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard says there shouldn't be a threshold. And the reason for that is to be complete, you need to calculate, to know if that you're going across that threshold, you need to calculate. So if you calculate it, you may just as well keep it. So that's their argument. However, they say that if there is a 5% change, if you find an error and that error drives a 5% change in your emission, that's the threshold. So you should recalculate. So there is an indication of a threshold, but not quite a threshold. The SBTi is clearer. Anything above 5% can't be excluded. So if it's less than 5%, then that works. Then you go the ISO 1464-1. You can exclude what's non-relevant sources. And what is non-relevant? It's a company that decides what is and isn't relevant. And it needs to be relevant to the user of this. So the end user, that's what it needs to be looking into. And then you go 14268, part 1, which Petya mentioned, is going to replace the past standard, the PAS standards, which is about carbon neutrality. And that requires to publish a neutrality report. And if you make exclusion, you've got to justify those exclusions. So you can make them, but you need to justify them. So you can see again how you've got convergence in terms of principles, overarching principle, but you've got divergence in the details. So step 3, what are the takeaway from step 3? So in terms of organization, keep it consistent. So if you've only got one site, it's fairly easy. But if you've got multiple sites, or even if it's those multiple sites across multiple countries, then that could be a bit more challenging. But it should be always the same. So if you choose crowd to gate, if you choose a supply chain authorities and FCA, you need to apply across the organizations. In terms of operation, look at materiality and materiality of all scopes, not just scope 3, which is the one it's mainly used for, but you can look at scope 1 and 2. In scope 1, you may have like fugitive emissions or something that is immaterial or not. And then in terms of scope 3, which is a most complex one with 15 categories, look at the relevance of each categories and look at the quality of the data. So that's what you want to consider when you look at your step 3. And remember, step 3 is about the where. Now, looking into step 4 for the how, it's about defining the process. So in here, we're looking at a range of methodologies, which is an update from the methodology we looked at previously in the previous webinar on standards. We're still looking at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the big one, and I would say the mother of all standards. The SBTi, which has taken prominence in our review, and that's what Petya has been talking about a lot. And then in here, I've added the 4768-1, which is about to replace the PA standard, but not yet on carbon neutrality. So that's the methodology we will consider today. So if I look at the greenhouse gas protocol, what directions, what trends is that taking, where is it going? Then if you want, it's about facilitating the comparability between entities. That's what they want to achieve. So how are they going to achieve that? Operational boundaries, they want to review that, they want to change that. And the big one here is Scope 3 requirements. They want to create, currently, and a lot of people have chosen the Greenhouse Gas Protocol because Scope 3 reporting is optional. So that's a requirement that may change going in future and our Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards. And one of the reasons, again, is to facilitate comparability for consistency between standards. Scope 3 is mandatory in the SBTi. Standard organizational governance, consolidation across the standard. That's what I've just mentioned, how they want to make sure that it's consistency across all the standards. Tracking your emission over time, and here is the threshold. So whereas originally they say, well, it shouldn't be a threshold for what I've just explained, they are reconsidering that because every other standard have a threshold. So that's another area they want to look at. Organizational boundaries, they want to align with financial accounting. So the idea being that how do you do your spend-based methods, and how can you marry carbon with pounds or dollars or currency, basically. So that's the other area they're looking at. And then in terms of data, they are looking at splitting major and minor emissions. So you can see the trend is moving towards, and that's the overarching standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard, you've also got Scope 2. And Scope 2, is about, your electricity, that sort of things. And they want to improve that. And how they're going to improve that, they're looking at the market-based methods, and in there they want to review the quality criteria requirements. There is no criteria. They would recommend the PPA, which gives you, I would say, a substantial agreement, substantial base to make your claim on. Pardon me. But that's what they want to formalize. In the location-based method, they are looking at the granularity. So how do you get more information on your location-based method? And here, that's where you use the grid electricity. And then on reporting the impact, they want to incentivize a high impact decarbonization. What does that mean? That means that if, let's say you've got, for example, if you're in the US and you've got a plant in the US and a plant in Mexico, then you may find out that decarbonizing your supply, the Scope 2, your electricity, may not be the best impact because your plant in Mexico may release all the air core and gases in the atmosphere and have a greater impact. And ultimately, the US want to be a green grid by 2035, if I remember correctly. So that would be an example. So in here, maybe, becoming green in terms of supply of Scope 2 may not be the priority. The priority may be stopping to release, gases, your Scope 1, into the atmosphere in Mexico rather than being carbon neutral. So that's the concept, is how do you incentivize the high impact side of things. So that's your Scope 2. And then your Scope 3, you want to look at that. And there, what they're looking at, well, Scope 2 data is the value chain reduction. And here, what you've got is what's called well to tank. So they want to look at how Scope 2 impacts Scope 3. In terms of boundaries, they are looking at mandatory reporting of Scope 3, the same as the SBTi. In terms of data collections, they want to phase out the spend-based method. And that's a big challenge because a lot of ways to assess Scope 3 originally is a spend-based method. And the spend-based method, if you say for so many pounds spent on average, I've got so many emissions, carbon emissions. And that's a big challenge because a lot of tools out there are using that spend-based method. So that's an area. They want to look at biogenic emission and removal. So bioemission, if you think you've got a biomass boiler, that's where the emissions come from. In terms of governance, and here you go, you see again interoperability between standards, and within standard, interoperability between the various greenhouse gas protocol standards, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and interoperability between these standards and other standards. And emission factors, they want guidance on the use because different countries got different emission factors, how you get there, so they want to create guidance. So that's where the greenhouse gas protocol is going. It gives you an idea of what they're looking at, what they want to change, and what you need to look out for. If you look at the SBTI, I haven't done a summary because it is quite substantial. So they used to have the corporate standard, and just when COP26 came out, they issued the net zero standard, and that became the corporate net zero standard. So you've got a new standard, the corporate net zero standard. And in there, you've got your criteria. So this is the fact where you see the criteria when you're going to be assessed. And then there is also a document they've issued that shows the main changes between those standards. But what you need to take out of all these is, if you look into this, there's a closer alignment between the SBTI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So as I mentioned earlier on, you still have divergence in the details. You still have a strong convergence in the overarching principles, but now they are all realizing that they need to be, I would say, consistent between each others. So there is a way to measure various entities the same way. So that's the key message of that. We're going towards a closer alignment between the SBTI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And if I look at that carbon neutrality, who, as Petya mentioned, is going to kick in 2025, so it's 2060, which is still valid at the moment. What is it about carbon neutrality? So it's about carbon neutral conditions, and here they are setting offsetting criteria. So you need to be correct in the way you go about offsetting. They are setting criteria, definition of what is quality offsetting, so you can't just plant tree in your garden type thing. Then carbon neutrality claim, it becomes a public declaration, so it needs to be available to everybody, the whole public. And then in terms of residual greenhouse gas emissions, it is post reduction. You need to reduce first. You can't use, you can't use what if you want your offsetting. You can't use your offsetting in here to just reduce your greenhouse gas. You need to reduce first, and then you've got your residual, and then you've got your residual, you can use offsetting. So, and the state of being carbon neutral, indeed, is about you start with greenhouse gas emission reduction, post-reduction. Then you look at removal enhancement, and then when you finish, you look at offsetting. So offsetting come at the end, not at the start. Offsetting is not a license to pollute. But the big one, which is coming up at the moment, is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and mainly in Europe. And what is the concept? So Europe is covering key sectors: cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen. And the big one for us tends to be iron and steel, possibly electricity. And how does it work? It works that in the EU, you've got EU ETS, the emission trading scheme. And if you think about it at the moment, it could be, as an example, it could be 90 euros per ton. And why is the emission trading scheme? Well, the emission trading scheme is basically companies are given an emission allowance, and they are given permits. And if they underuse, they can sell them. And if they overuse, they can buy them. And these happen in auctions. So as an example, let's assume is the auction goes up in 80 euros in EU ETS. Then if you are a non-EU producer, which is the case for the UK now, And then maybe you will have a local ETS. So here, let's say it's 10 euros. Then what happens is the importer in Europe will be charged CBAM certificate to 80 euros, bringing the total to 90 euros, which is in par with the ETS. So that's what CBAM is trying to achieve. So to make sure that Europe is as competitive as the rest of the world, and to make sure that there is a drive toward decarbonization. Now, what is the timeline? So for third country producers, how does that impact them? Because that's really the UK. So 2026, you're still giving a strong allowance, so that's your emissions. The yellow one or the orange one is what you're giving as a European importer. That's what you're given for free. And then there may be a label paid in a country you are importing from. And remember, you're looking at that from a EU importer. And then you may have to render some of your CBAM obligations. That's 2026. That's, a couple of years' time. By 2030, the plan is that your free ETS is going to decrease. And that's what you get here, that blue line. That's the free ETS decreasing. And then it's fair to anticipate that in a country, there will be a greater ETS or a greater carbon tax paid in the country the goods come from. But then your CBAM surrounding will increase to compensate for all this. And that's where the costs are, because that's free, but that you pay for if you are an EU importer. And then by 2035, you can see there won't be any more ETS, pre-ETS. It's all going to be CBAM. Again, it's fair to assume that that part in the country will increase, but that's what they will need to buy and surrender. So that's why they are all interested. That's why they're asking for it. That's what they're going to be facing. So that's where we are today, but that's where we are going tomorrow. And so what are the stakeholders in CBAM? So you've got those manufacturers outside Europe. You've got the EU importer, which is going to be the reporting declarant. It's the importer, right? For WTO reason, it's the importer. You've got the custom authorities, you've got the European Commission, and you've got the competent authority of the country the importer is located in. So the importer will import CBAM goods, and that's unusual, and will largely use your custom paperwork with custom. Nothing to clear the import, and that here is unusual, nothing new. Now the new bit is the EU importer may revert back to the manufacturer and say, give me the specific embedded emission in the product I'm buying, and ideally give them to me in accordance with that template which has been provided to me by the commissions. So that's what happened. And why do they do that? Because they've got to submit a quarterly CBAM report to the commissions. And the key thing here is the custom authorities will inform the European Commissions, and the European Commission needs to make sure both of them match each other's. That's what it is. And then they're going to speak to the competent authorities. So there'll be an exchange of information where the Commission is going to speak to the competent authority and say, here maybe there is a problem you need to fix, or here is what you can expect, and everything is okay. Now, the competent authority in a country of the importer will again come back to the importer and say, if there is a mistake, can you fix it? And if the importer doesn't fix it, penalty is possible. So that's the process. That's how the stakeholder interact into that CBAM, EU CBAM. Where it matters for the UK is that's where we are, because we are outside Europe. So we are going to receive requests from those customers we've got in Europe. Now, when we get a request, when you want to look at it's a regulation, again, it's about the details. And if you look at Annex 2, there's a little note for which only direct emission is to be accounted for. And I've got an example here of goods like screw, bolts, nuts, or structure, metal or metals, then only carbon dioxide is to be included, i.e. it's not CO2e, but CO2. So that's where you want to look at the detail of that regulations on Annex 2. And the reason for that is your specific avoided emissions is what? It's your direct emission plus your indirect emission divided by your activity level, which could be weights. And you can see now that in some cases, those indirect emissions, you don't need them. You only focus on the direct emissions. And if you look at what emission you account for as CO2, it's not CO2e, but it's CO2. That's what that says. So that's why it's important to look. So you look and check Annex 2, is that direct only? Is that CO2 only? That's why you're looking at the details. So what's going to happen for people outside the EU? Well, a steel exporter and it will be squeezed and they're going to have to decarbonize. So that's the one exporting steel directly to Europe. The refiner and the crude producer are probably going to use the same technique, one for leveraging their position, the other one to maximize their value. And that is about diverting the carbon intensive product to other regions. So the non-EU countries are going to get the dirty stuff and EU countries are going to get the clean stuff. But what you're going to get, and that's what we're looking at here, is the government will put in place domestic carbon prices. And the reason for that is, as I explained earlier on, is that the government are going to want to get the money in rather than giving the money away to Europe. So what they're going to do is put a carbon price on, and then that will allow them to be accounted for, and then the CBAM will decrease, as I explained earlier on. And why does that matter so much for the UK? Well, it matters because in terms of import to the EU, the two big, the UK is number 3, and after Russia and Turkey. I'm not sure what's going to happen with Russia, but it's number 3 at the moment. And the big one is about aluminium and iron and steel. So there is a lot of import in Europe of products from the UK. And in terms of export, UK exported 80% of what is exported as part of the CBAM from the UK goes to Europe. So it's likely it's going to have a great impact on the UK. So the UK is thinking, okay, once I'm going to have a UK CBAM. And if you look at the regulation, as I said, it applies to goods, except when they've already been subject to a carbon pricing system, which is fully linked with the EU ETS. And you can see here, only the UK is likely to get there. The EU CBAM is going to be sitting there, 100%. And you can see how California, Canada, China is not going to make it. So there's going to be a cost here. But that's why, so the UK is looking at that. And I think, well, how can I do this? Well, the way you do it, you create a UK CBAM. And the UK CBAM is the same process. It's copied on UK. It's using the UK ETS. And the UK ETS and the UK CBAM are going to be aligned with EU CBAM and EU ETS. And it's the same concept. So you've got your imported emissions, because that's to protect businesses in the UK. And then you've got your carbon prices minus what's been incurred already in the imported countries. And you've got your CBAM liability. So exactly the same process. It's exactly the same. So that's what you get. So that's what you're going to see, and that's the UK CBAM. So if I'm thinking about it, right, what's the takeaway from step 4, choose your methodology? The takeaway is it's a greater convergence with the standards, but remember, divergence still exists, so you need to look at the details. You need to use a standard that fits your industry, your organization. Avoid customers' education if you can. So again, that's when you look at your peers, that's when you look at how it's measured. Maybe if you're influenced by CBAM, then you may want to look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You may want to look at the Greenhouse Protocol if you've got the PPN notice I mentioned before. DLC 21. So that's the sort of thing you may want to look at. But the devil is in the detail. As mentioned, you can see how there is like Annex 2 I've mentioned, or there are other areas which matters as well. So that's the takeaway from choosing your methodology step 4. Now, to remind you, we're here to help. You. Support is available. We've developed tools, roadmap innovation. We've provided data. We've got now 20 webinars that's been delivered. We can support you with time, and we've had over 300 one-to-ones year to date. We created a monthly newsletter to share information. This is mainly on standard evolutions and funding availability and other information innovations. Skills, we've developed 2 training courses. You are welcome to join at a substantial discount for members. And then we created a library of 481 reports, again, free to members. So we're trying to address those challenges that stop companies moving onto the net zero journey. And that's what we've developed. So if you've got any interest, then please get in touch and we can support you. So I would like to thank you for taking the time and joining us today. And I would also like to thank Petya for taking the time to join us and spending the time putting together that great presentation we had earlier on. And I'm going to open the floor to any question you may have. Please feel free to come off mute or put a question in the chat. Nothing. Hope it's no information overload. As I said, if you want to, all will be recorded and slide will be put on our microsites on the Scottish Engineering website. So you can get access to all these, and you can always revert back and to me and ask any question you want on those processes, or we can organize one-to-ones to address specificity. I am conscious that those webinars, whereas specific in the WTHs, are still fairly generic because we are trying to answer the needs of a range of people, organizations. So please have a look and let me know. Well, if there isn't any questions, then I think we can stop our meeting here.
Question coming.
I think you'll get maybe 20 minutes back. Okay, so we'll stop here. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for having joined us, and thanks for taking the time. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.